down the street and ask any Canadian to name the world's most endangered ecosystem. Chances are they'll say either the rainforests or the coral reefs. These two ecological hotspots are the focus of international campaigns to protect biodiversity.
Well, the international community has been making its opinion clear.
They're the subject of social awareness campaigns through the news and social media. As you walk down grocery aisles, you'll see products with logos about protecting marine life or rainforests. And chances are your favorite restaurant has started offering paper straws. There's no denying the impact we are having on the planet. And with all this increased awareness, you may be surprised to find out that one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world is actually one we have right here in Canada.
Here in Western Canada, we have less than 20% of our native grasses left. In some areas, that number is as low as 13%, which is really sad because you think of the cultural significance that these grasslands have for Western Canada, first the Indigenous peoples, and then the settlers that came out. Everybody talked about the prairies as being a vast inland sea of grass. And honestly, if you've ever had the opportunity to spend an afternoon in a grassland when the wind is blowing and you hear it swishing, you would think that you're in a sea. But it's disappearing, and it's disappearing at a real alarming rate.
The loss of Canada's native grasslands is also a loss for the world. Humans depend on nature for our very survival, and the loss of grasslands creates major environmental issues such as flooding, loss of wildlife habitat, and a reduction in soil carbon sequestration.
In healthy native grass, there can be over 100 different plant species within a 5-acre radius. Not only are there plants, but there's a lot of different wildlife.
There's more than 80% of Canada's species at risk that depend on grasslands. By losing our grasslands, it's actually going to be extremely impactful on the majority of our endangered species.
Basically with grass, what they say is that you've got what you have above ground, you also have below ground. So if you have grass that looks like this above ground, then you also have roots that look like this below ground. But with native prairies, it's like threefold, where the roots really extend deep into the soil. The benefit of that is there's two cycles of carbon, and the above ground stuff every year in the spring, like right now, it's sucking carbon from the air and producing plant matter above ground and below. But all the stuff above ground gets cycled back into the air again usually by the end of the summer, or for sure by the next year. The stuff that goes into the ground is the roots, and that stuff's what becomes really stable and long lasting in the soil. And that's how they build organic matter here. So this ranch is 65,000 acres, and it sequesters, currently right now, there are approximately 2 million tons of carbon, which is the equivalent to the emissions from over 100,000 Canadians for a year. So that is stable, long-term, and permanent in the ground as long as we have an intact ecosystem and cattle grazing on it.
Over the last decade, the story of cows and the environment has been a hot topic, but the narrative has been focused on cattle's contribution to climate change and the destruction of the rainforest. The idea that cattle could be integral to the health of an ecosystem is a very different story. In order to understand the real impact of cattle on a specific ecosystem, we have to look at the context.
The context is so important. We're not standing in a rainforest, we're standing on the Canadian prairie. And so in that context, we need grazers, and we need a livestock industry to keep the prairie, what's precious left of it, where it is. And so in our Canadian context, let's think about what's most sustainable for here.
So what role do cattle play in the grasslands ecosystem?
What happens is the glaciers came and wiped off all the topsoil, so we had no life. There was nothing here, and it grew topsoil down into the soil. I always thought that topsoil grew up and it was an accumulation of something, but topsoil actually grows down into the dirt, and it's just a conversion of inorganic, dead rock and silt and sand into actually this dark black life, which is like an Amazon rainforest, but underground, where you have little tiny T-Rex predators, and they're going around and killing other things, and prey animals and parasites, and it's a whole complex web underground, an ecosystem that's alive. And by having cattle here, They're creating that life. They're the keystone species in this ecosystem. It was the bison before them, and the bison completely built this into the ecosystem that we have today and built all the topsoil and sequestered all the carbon. And when they disappeared, these grasslands became sick, and they needed to have another keystone large herbivore grazing on it.
When a keystone species is removed from a habitat, all other species are affected, and some may disappear from that ecosystem or even become extinct. Without the presence of a grazing species on the grasslands, there's a devastating impact on the natural production cycle of the grass.
In the fall, that top growth dies and the root underneath the soil stays growing. But because the top growth has died, if it's not grazed and removed, what happens in the spring is it gets harder for the new growth to grow up through it, so the grass actually ends up starting to smother itself and all of the other species around it. So really, you need to have the grazers on there that are helping to remove and eat off some of that growth so that it can start regrowing again in the spring.
Without ranchers to keep these wide open spaces intact, we wouldn't have these amazing iconic landscapes. The families that own these ranches, it's been in their family for generations. They genuinely care about the land. And there's a really direct correlation between healthy land and healthy cows. Ranchers know that if they take care of the land, it's going to benefit, the whole cattle production industry. And so there's this really symbiotic relationship between cows and native grassland.
There's no better example of this than the story of the Grasslands National Park. Parks Canada, in hopes of preserving the prairie land and saving it from being plowed and turned into cropland, had their own ideas in 1988 about what would be good for the grass, and that did not include grazing. This created friction between Parks Canada and the local ranchers, who argued that grazing and disturbance were critical to healthy native prairie. For 20 years, much of the grass lay idle, grazed only occasionally by wandering wildlife. So what happened after removing cattle from native grasslands? The grasslands lost its biodiversity, and tame species of grasses such as crested wheatgrass began to take over. This also impacted wildflowers, pollinators, and the homes of birds that nest in the native grasses. Fortunately, Parks Canada listened. They researched and worked closely with Saskatchewan ranchers, conservationists, and scientists to bring cattle back to the national park in order to benefit native birds and other species.
We need that grazing impact. So when we think about the grass that we see here, when we have a grazer come along and bite those plants and create an interesting and dynamic canopy structure in that grass, that creates homes and types of homes for all kinds of birds and all kinds of other animals, and lets light down to the soil surface to let different types of plants grow and compete, and all of those things add to the biodiversity and these bio-rich communities that we have.
There's deer and elk and grizzly bears and worms and all sorts of things in here, and if you were to cultivate this and grow lettuce, you would have to get rid of all of those other things, whereas cattle just share the ecosystem. They don't use it completely, they just share it with everything else, and that's what's really special, is that cattle are able to be a part of the ecosystem without damaging it, but actually to benefit it.
While the native prairie ecosystem is a pretty tough ecosystem, it can survive a lot. The one thing it can't survive is being broken up. When the native prairie is plowed or tilled or converted for other uses, even if it's only used under those different uses for 5 or 10 years and then seeded right back down to grass, it never comes back in this part of the world as true native prairie.
When the Canadian prairies were settled, a large portion of the native grasslands were lost to the development of cities and towns, construction of highways, and the plowing of land for growing crops and other uses. With 74% of Canada's native grasslands now lost forever, preserving what's left is critical. Working with ranchers to help manage the grasslands by using domesticated livestock to graze the land that bison roamed for thousands of years may be able to preserve this precious resource for future generations. Right now, we have a choice, but if we wait until it's gone, there won't be a choice left to make.
I heard a quote once, and it talked about the extinction of a species. And it's a very, very powerful quote, because it said, is a species extinct when there are no longer any species left on the planet? Or are they extinct when there are so few that can't hear each other calling to each other? So could you imagine that, being an animal that calls this place home, and there's so few spaces left that you can survive, that you can't hear any of your mates calling? So, you know, the thing is being in conservation, you kind of have to be an eternal optimist, and I'm very optimistic, and I really think that these are beautiful landscapes. They provide so much to humans, and I think we've all come to a spot in our civilization where we're starting to realize that we depend on nature and we really have to live in symbiosis with it. So I really think that there's a lot of hope for these grasslands, that if enough people start to care about them, we'll never have to wonder if they go extinct or not.